Container prices are skyrocketing and worldwide ports are congested. How to deal with the supply chain challenges in ocean freight? Let's talk about that during this webinar. Hello, good morning and welcome to this webinar that we organize in cooperation with Zencargo. Shippers who use ocean freight have more challenges than ever before. They have to pay record amounts for their cargo and cope with a lot of delays. What are the outlooks? How to handle this? How does this affect the worldwide supply chains? And how will the market find a new equilibrium? We are going to talk about that during this webinar with two guests. Here in the studio is Onno de Jong, researcher at Ecorys, and joining us through a video call is Richard Fattal, co-founder of digital freight forwarder Zencargo. If you have any questions for them or want to make comments to the other attendees, please feel free to use the public chat of this webinar on the right side of your screen. Onno, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the studio.
Yeah.
Just for the people who don't know Ecorys, can you give us a quick introduction?
Well, the very quick introduction. We're a Rotterdam-based consulting and research firm. Actually also quite some offices in the UK. And I'm part of the transport and logistics team where we advise our clients, who are mainly governments or port authorities, on the global affairs and the state of play in logistics. So very happy to be here with you this morning.
Okay, so we're going to talk about all of the current developments extensively. First I want to welcome Richard Fattal. Richard, thank you for joining us digitally.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Can you just give us a short introduction of Zencargo? Who are you guys?
Sure thing. So Zencargo is a global digital freight forwarder, and we're headquartered in the UK, but with European headquarters in Amsterdam. And we help some of the world's fastest growing consumer businesses to move their cargo around the world, and with a real focus on agility at the item level for those businesses. Okay,
Richard, great. So let's kick off then. Let's first talk about the bottlenecks in ocean freight at the moment. Onno, what are the problems?
Well,
what's going wrong?
Congestion is a very big thing, especially in North America. Probably also Zencargo will have quite some experience with it now. More than 70 ships waiting at LA Long Beach. Also within Europe, there are more ports to choose from, but still we see delays, capacity constraints, especially also in hinterland logistics. So, and if your container is shipped and arrived on time, it comes with a hefty fee. So, as you said, it's tremendous challenges for the industry.
Yeah, and what's causing all this?
It's after 2 years. Can we still blame the COVID pandemic? Well, to some extent, maybe the bullwhip effect we're seeing is that at the start of the pandemic, we saw massive cancellations of orders, ocean liners cutting back on schedules, hefty recovery, and still we see the after effects of it, and the tremendous price increases. Yeah, that's something. It's a combination now.
Yeah, and you have two sides. One side says, well, there's a big increase in cargo volumes, so the supply chains are not able to handle this, and there's another side of the sector that says maybe the shipping lines are making too much profit at the moment and taking a little bit more benefit of the current situation. Which side are you on?
I think there's something to say for both sides. 5 years ago we were discussing that the Christmas season was in danger because of the Hanjin went bankrupt. And now we're seeing massive profits. It is understandable that these container liners, that their shareholders are saying, okay, please make some profits to recover from a couple of years that have been rather bad. But on the other side, everybody is now trying to make the best out of it. And then the combination, I can understand the behavior of all the single players, but from a supply chain perspective, then things tend to get wrong.
Yeah, so what's the outlook? Will it stay like this for the next year, or maybe for the next 2 years, or will it get better?
Well, if we look, for instance, air cargo, IATA is very positive from their perspective, so from the perspective of the airlines on what will be going on. I think we saw a little decrease in the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index last week. We're waiting for this week's figure, but it remains at a very high level. So I don't see tariffs coming down anytime soon, especially given, as you said, the very high demand for space, both in air freight, ocean, even rail.
So we need to learn to cope with this. So Richard, of course, you talk with shippers on a daily basis. How can they balance price, security, and flexibility? Because the market needs to find a new equilibrium, it seems.
Yeah, 100%. So it's interesting, what you were saying with regards to the ocean carriers and, being a time of all-time profitability. I think there's a broad structural challenge in ocean, which is that not only do you, as a shipper, find it difficult to commit to whether your cargo and your volume is going to be ready in any given week. You might not own your own manufacturing capacity. There are challenges at manufacturers. Right now we see electricity shortages in China as an example. But also as a shipping line, there's a challenge that you might not be able to get the vessels into the port as per the original schedule. So there's a challenge which is quite different to, for example, the consumer air industry, where you buy an airline ticket, you pay for the airline ticket, and you pretty much have to turn up. There are some cancellation policies. You can maybe cancel at the last minute, but by and large, you'll pay quite a hefty cancellation fee if you cancel. The ocean shipping industry hasn't really worked like that. It's worked, in a way where there's a lot of different tariffs. There's a lot of different terms and conditions depending on the nature of the shipper and depending on the way you work with the shipping line. And they've really, found it difficult for these structural reasons to get to a world where the shipper and the shipping line are happy to kind of agree and commit and work together. And that's kind of the security that we're talking about here. And I think that shippers need to be kind of realistic about the challenges that shipping lines face, but also realistic about the agility that they need in their own business. So what I think is very interesting right now is that shipping lines have started to look at ways of working with shippers that are a little bit more contractual. So, for example, over the last few months and going into next year and the year beyond, they're looking at ways to have longer-term contracts with shippers. And they're looking at ways in which shippers might contract and have to pay, for example, dead freight charges if the cargo doesn't move. What I would say is that shippers should be looking at these options, but they should also be looking at, taking a certain proportion of their volume and not contracting that part of their volume, and thinking about having, agility and variability and options. Mm-hmm. And I think essentially, one part is the contracting strategy. How do you have the right options, and how do you work with a forwarding partner who can help you have the right options? So, part of your volume might be contracted where you feel there's more stability and more ability to commit. Mm-hmm. Part of it might be more fluid, where you need to get, options at the last minute, and you need to get access to new carriers. Particularly in ocean, there are some small carriers that have come to the market where they can get you space on a vessel really at the last minute. And so your forwarder should be plugging you into that. And then I would say the last thing that you really need is the flexibility in the way that you work. And that comes through data and forecasting and your booking strategy to be able to take advantage of having some longer term committed volume and some volume that you can move a little bit more at the last minute. So I would say for a larger shipper, you need a variety of options, and you need to think about over the longer term, what proportion of your business do you need to have a certain amount of certainty over in terms of cost of goods sold and availability of inventory, and what part are you willing to be a bit more flexible on in order to maximize margin if potentially the market does slacken towards the end of this coming year and beyond that.
Yeah, and I can imagine that for a large shipper that it's more easy. They have a whole supply chain department. But what about small to medium businesses? What can they expect during this time? What do they need to do?
Yeah, so I would say, one of the things that we've seen through the COVID crisis is that, the best made plans have gone out the window from a planning perspective. And I think the big gap is in this agile execution capability to understand what's going on around the world at your global manufacturers and be able to make last minute decisions. And I would say that they should very much look to their supply chain partners to help them to be more agile and to be able to make decisions closer to the last time that they can possibly make them. if that makes sense. So that, that's really where the agility comes from. So I think that they should certainly look to those partners to first of all have connectivity around the world, but also to have systems connectivity to their factories, so that they can really understand, okay, what is ready where, what are the available options on the market, and how can I pivot, or how can I be a little bit agile here to make a decision? Because that's not a capability that a small and medium-sized business will really have in-house, both in terms of systems, but also in terms of their, people capabilities and the geographies that they're working in.
Yeah. So, Richard, there's a question from the audience coming in, Ronnie Koolhorst, and he wants to know how will the carriers now ensure that they will honor the new contracts, because the contracts so far were worthless?
Yes, certainly. I think the reality is that the contracts that were struck were based on this kind of gentleman's agreement. So what we've seen this year is that shippers tended to get a percentage of their volume committed by the carriers, because they wanted to kind of keep up the relationship, and they were comfortable that a certain percentage of their business would move regularly at certain rates. And then they rebased the rates quite a bit higher in the spot market for the rest of the volume. I think what we're seeing now is that carriers are open to entering into a couple of different types of contract. I think one will remain a little bit more on this gentleman's agreement type approach, where you can be assured of a certain percentage of the volume. Now, that's also subject to the reality of the sailing schedules, which have, obviously the reliability of the sailing schedule has been terrible this year. And so some of the volume that they will sign up to with shippers will be on that basis. They'll want to continue working on that basis, more of a gentleman's agreement. But there is some volume that they're willing to move on a committed basis, which means that there would be a penalty if you as a shipper don't turn up with cargo, but also a penalty if they don't make available the space. But of course, there are some caveats around that with regard to things out of their control around this, around the sailing schedules. So I would say it is important to have some agility in your volumes, because the carriers work on different alliances and different loops, and so if one vessel or one carrier is delayed, there is, and you have urgent cargo, you do need to have some agility to be able to move it sooner.
Yes. So, Richard, thanks for now. We'll talk to you later on, because I want to move to Onno, because Han Boers makes a remark. Isn't it also the case that currently the alliances simply use their power? What do you think?
Yeah, that's always a very hard. If an economist, you say somebody has a lot of market power, it always leads to the question: okay, is it abuse of market power? And that's something I think that's a bit out of scope. But indeed, in the end, you have a market where you can only go to 3 major players, and that's not a good thing. I mean, one of the responses has been that logistics services providers or forwarders, they just charter their own vessel. So you saw relatively small vessels, 3,000 TEUs, being chartered and then making direct calls from a Chinese export port to somewhere in Europe. That can be a reaction.
Is that a solution? Because it's not scalable, it seems to me.
No, in the end, it's not a solution, and it only works if you're a very large forwarder that you can do so. So indeed, your question about the SMEs is very relevant. What can small businesses do if you're stuck between having to negotiate? You can't negotiate directly. Well, you can with the big carriers, but then you know that your rate will not be that attractive. What can your logistics service provider do for you? And that's quite a hassle, I can imagine, at this moment.
Yeah. And how are the ports handling the situation? Because we are receiving messages of more than 100 ships waiting in line to enter Long Beach. And in Europe, maybe the problem is not so big, but in the UK, there are a lot of congestion. So how are they handling this?
The problem is you see both. Of course, you see at the terminals you see congestion, and furthermore in the hinterland, and especially in the US, you see that the shortage of truck drivers is not limited to the UK. It's also quite a problem now in the US that you have to, or rail yards that get congested. So if you can move the cargo into the port, it doesn't mean it's at the distribution center yet. So I have to admit that from a Rotterdam perspective, because normally in this time of the year we always have these debates and discussions on the congestion, and this year, but that's maybe also a question for me to the audience, we haven't heard that many very alarming signals. I mean, we can imagine things are not going that well, but it's not that alarms were sounded, or in proper Dutch, the noodklok was geluid. It's not as bad as it seemed like 3 years ago. So that's quite a compliment also to the sector that, in the end, things are moving.
Yeah. Just checking if Richard is still on the line.
I am. Can you see me?
Yeah. So Richard, as we were discussing here, it's difficult for shippers to know when their cargo arrives, because you book a freight load and then you expect it to arrive maybe on the 21st, but due to congestion in the ports, you never know at the moment when it's actually arriving. So how can you still make sure the customer service and communication with shippers and communicate those delays? Because delays and pricing change per minute, it seems, at the moment.
Yeah, so I would say, I think great customer service comes from understanding your customer, and that's the number one thing. And so, the difficulty in this market is that these businesses, whether you're a kind of consumer retailer or e-commerce business, their underlying customers, their end customers, are demanding and have ever higher expectations. And so, we need to understand the underlying reason why they need the information and who needs the information. And that's where good customer service comes from. So is it the buying and merchandising team at a retailer who need to, get stock in because it's going absolutely out of stock, and there's, a marketing campaign that's running and this is the hot item? Is it, the business-to-business sales team that's promised the stock to their favorite customer? Why is it, and what is the impact? And I think once we understand that, then that helps to inform the kind of SLAs and the kind of communication timelines and the level of communication and proactivity that we need to deliver for the customer. I think some of the information, is best digested almost automatically. So, we have customers, for example, who are selling furniture where the update in the vessel ETA flows through via API and then is fed to their end customers via email, telling them that, unfortunately, this sofa is not going to arrive because of this particular delay, on the water. And actually, the end customers can kind of understand that because they see it in the news. What they don't want is to be left in the dark. Other times, it's much more about a conversation. So having the availability of data, for example, on a system, but then being able to highlight the things that are going to impact them and come with solutions, before you're being asked. And so I think it depends on the situation, what the right solution is. But it really all comes down to understanding what the impact of the delay or the issue or the service problem is on their business, and then having a solution, ready in hand. You won't always have all the solutions, right? Like if there are 100 vessels off the port of Long Beach and you're on one of them, it's a challenge. But then the question is, how can you plan around that? Do you need to bring more stock in by air freight? How do you get things ready for when the cargo finally gets into Fort Devand, into the warehouse? So I would say it's about understanding the stock and understanding the customer. And if you understand that and you have the right attitude, then you can deliver. Of course, you need an understanding customer as well in the context of the current market environment.
Yeah. And what do you think is the difference between businesses that still have a strong supply chain and maybe the ones that you see struggle at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's both resilience and agility. So obviously some businesses have essentially committed working capital to having more stock in this current environment. So that's one element, but I don't think that that's necessarily the thing that is a sustainable competitive advantage. It's helped this year. I think the ones that we really see performing both have been thoughtful about stock levels, but also have the agility in their business to be able to react. And I think that comes from attitude. Like, I think at the board level, at the executive team level, at the leadership level, there needs to be a commitment that, like, supply chain agility, access to data, bringing everyone around one version of the truth to make decisions is something that the business is really important to the business. And then we've seen those businesses that really care about those capabilities having a real advantage in this market, because they've been able to decipher what it makes sense to move faster, what they can hold back, and make those decisions. So I think that one thing is being able to obviously invest in stock, but the other is having the agility where you don't need to make those stock investment decisions to be able to change things closer closer to the time.
Yeah. So let's make this webinar a bit more interactive, and let's see what the opinion of the audience is. So for that, we have a poll set up for you. And the first poll is, do you see shippers cancel their transports? And I'm asking our technical department to make sure that the poll is in the screen, and you can provide 3 answers. Choose for yes, due to high prices, yes, due to limited capacity, or no. Onno, what do you think the audience will answer?
It's a very interesting one. It will also, I think, depend on who is our audience. If you're indeed, if you have to rely on the spot market and you're selling, consumer goods at a discount store, then it might be a very different choice you have to make, as opposed to when you're in high-end manufacturing. So I think it will very much depend on who is answering the question. But I'm curious to learn what our audience thinks.
Yeah, in a few minutes I'm going to give you the results. Richard, just a quick answer from you. Do you see on the daily practice that shippers cancel their shipments?
Not often in this market, and I think it really is a function of 2 things. One, delays. So sometimes their end customer actually, doesn't need it anymore because of the timelines, or they can't work to the given timeline. It doesn't make sense. The other is what Onno talked about, which is the value of the cargo and the value of the transport, and whether the unit economics make sense. But I think what we've seen from the market in terms of the rates going up is that for the vast majority of shippers, they can actually continue managing their business at these rates, even if it is very difficult in terms of the profitability.
Yeah, so Onno, I have the results for you. So at the moment, the results are in. 38% says yes, due to high prices. 24% says yes, due to limited capacity. And 38% says no. So that means a majority of the audience sees shippers really cancel their shipments. So what effect will that have on the supply chains?
Yeah, probably what we will see is that in the end, in the shelves, we'll either see different products or products not being there. And it's an interesting question. Can you in the end raise the price you charge your customer? But it's more than I had expected. And over half of the respondents said yes, we're now canceling transports shipments because of the high prices.
Yeah. So maybe that's different sectors. Maybe in the low-priced goods. I can imagine if you have a shipping container from China and it's filled with, as we say in Dutch, prularia, then it's a different choice than, for example, when you ship machines.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're part of a manufacturing chain, I mean, in the end, you often don't have a choice. If you have your contractual obligations because you're part of a bigger chain. But if you're indeed now just working on the spot market and you're a small importer in the Netherlands, then I can imagine that indeed that you would say, well, it doesn't work this year, maybe better luck next time.
Yeah, do you think that...
We do, sorry.
Yeah,
no, please.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say we do see a lot of customers looking at sort of Sku Level Rationalization. So they're looking at individual items, individual business lines, and they're saying, does this business line make sense? Do I need to look at alternative manufacturing or locations for this business line? But it tends to be, at least on our side in terms of what we're seeing, a subset of the business. So it wouldn't be that, you would say you're going to stop shipping from China, for example. It would be much more that you would look at a line item level and you would say, what's the implied margin in this business line? Does it make sense? What are we doing here? Do we hold back on that? So I think, probably the reality of the poll is that there's a lot of people who are making those considerations, and they actually need the data and the tools to make them. But that it doesn't necessarily mean a wholesale change in the supply chain at a business-wide level, but on an individual SKU level, it oftentimes might make sense.
Yeah, and Richard, do you see businesses invest in their supply chains going forward to make sure that they have the items they need?
Yes, certainly. I mean, we did see, and obviously we lived through multiple Brexits over here in the UK, and that was an example of a time when there was a lot of investing in the supply chain, overstocking, stocking ahead of the many Brexit deadlines we had. But I would say more broadly, yes, like the stock policies in terms of the months of inventory cover have generally increased in terms of the months of inventory cover that people are willing to hold. So there are investments going on in that regard.
Yeah. So let's move ahead with poll number 2, because I'm curious, Onno, if you mentioned maybe some shippers move to air freight, maybe some move to other modalities. So let's ask the audience. So poll number 2 states, do you see shippers move to other modalities instead of ocean freight? And you can choose for yes to rail, yes to air, yes to road, or no. What do you think, Onno?
Well, in the past we would say that indeed moving to rail was a very feasible option, especially in...
We have the new Silk Road.
Yeah, of course, definitely. And what we saw earlier this year was that price increases by rail were less hefty because it's less of a flexible market. So indeed you have less players who can arrange this transport for you. But it was an option. But on the other hand, the success of the shift to rail meant that also there you saw congestion, capacity constraints at border points, etc. So I'm curious, in air freight, there indeed the pandemic kicked in very hard with limiting capacity, with of course all the belly freight not being available, massive run on full freighters.
Yeah, and they even put some cargo on the passenger seats.
They put out the chairs and put in. Well, you can't fit the cargo containers, but still you can fit a lot of cargo in there. And given there the high prices, indeed, on a on a SKU level, you have to ask yourself the question: is it viable to look for an alternative?
Yeah, is it, Richard? Do you see shippers switching to, for example, air freight?
Yes, certainly. I mean, for some items, the difference, and obviously it depends on kind of the weight and the density of the items, and the difference between air freight and sea freight has obviously narrowed, through the COVID period. And whilst during COVID, when the PPE was flying around, we saw astronomical air freight rates, they've somewhat stabilized, although they're significantly above long-term averages. And we do see shippers using it more. The interesting thing, I guess, is that a lot of the airlines have relied on air freight as a product through the pandemic period, and this kind of shift to increased volumes of air freight because of the crunch in ocean freight capacity has helped very much support them. And I think modeling that and understanding that going forward is going to be very important for them in terms of understanding their profitability as well.
Yeah, and there's a question from the audience, from Bjorn Lahaye, and he wants to know, how about equipment availability? Is it still an issue? Are there enough containers at the moment? Because a few months ago that was really an issue.
I think it continues to be an issue. It's about repositioning more than the absolute numbers of containers, although the shipping lines have been ordering more and buying and really investing in containers over the past few months. I would say the real challenge is that you have cargo going into markets which are net importers, and therefore there's the challenge of the shipping lines to turn the containers around as fast as possible, and that's added to by the fact that there's a lot of port congestion. So, for example, we saw in the UK, as an example, that they shut out containers just because they didn't have enough space in the port to viably operate. And that shutting out of the containers, has another knock-on effect in terms of how you get them back, back to the Far East. So it is a problem. Some shippers are getting around this using shippers' own containers, which is something that we've seen more and more of. Some of the shipping lines accepting shippers' own containers where the shipper is leasing the container directly themselves. But I would say it's probably less of a problem than 6 to 8 weeks ago.
Yeah, and there's a reaction from Bart van Rossen. He says, we see a lot of model shift from containerized towards conventional shipping. Is that what you see as well, Onno?
Yeah, we've seen examples of bulk ships being chartered.
Yeah, Coca-Cola is maybe
Coca-Cola, that's 60,000 tons, I think. But it's not an option if you have e-commerce shipments. It works indeed if you can if you have a rather big flow of goods being moved around, but it wouldn't work for smaller items, LCL, no.
No, so maybe for a small percentage of shippers, that's a solution to change to bulk, for example, or whatever, but not for the majority.
No, I don't see that happening anytime soon. No.
So let's see the results. So the question was, do you see shippers move to other modalities instead of ocean freight? 54% says no, so about half says yes, and most of them to rail first, second to air, third to road. So 27% sees a modality shift to rail. Sounds that logical to you?
It does. I mean, we already saw last year that on the new Silk Road there was more transported than the very positive long-term projections of the Chinese government have been. And of course, they have been for this project. They have been ramping on, saying, "No, it will be a success, please." And in 2025, I think they said 2025 over 1 million TEU by rail, China to Europe. And last year they already managed to do so. So that has been a success. But on the other hand, then the stories came back, delays, congestion, also equipment scarcity, also on the new Silk Road. So
Corona is sometimes maybe a bigger problem with customs. You need to cross some borders.
Yeah, but I think in rail freight that has been rather good. But indeed, what I think that this poll shows is indeed that road is not an option for many of these trades. But indeed, I'm surprised that rail is 27%. It's a positive sign for the rail business. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Richard, do you think since Corona started, so for the last 18 months, do you think the role and profile of the supply chains within businesses have changed?
Yes, certainly. I would say that this, to me, is the biggest change that we see. The biggest change is the relevance of supply chain on the consciousness of business leaders and the extent to which they're involved in it, and they're really being thoughtful about what the future is for their business. So, I would say the frequency of conversations that we have with C-level executive, company owners, business leaders more broadly, is just sort of on another level to before coronavirus. Supply chain departments are increasingly given a seat in leadership. You see more chief supply chain officers than ever before. Chief supply chain officers are on the board of some of the businesses. And they're also being sort of honored. Businesses are being honored for their supply chain through Corona. And they're also being, they're publicly dealing with PR crises that relate to their supply chain as well on the flip side. So I think, it's not only within the scrutiny of the executive team of the businesses that we deal with, but it's also within public scrutiny. And I think what's interesting now is how, we take those changes and they flow through into the professionalization, the tooling, and the development of supply chain more broadly. And what I'm excited to see out of the back of it is, I think the Netherlands is really a leader in this regard. But the extent to which there's then further investment in supply chain education, supply chain roles more broadly, and supply chain professional development, which I'm kind of really excited about seeing more of as a knock-on consequence of the last 18 months.
Yeah, and do you think that's a temporary solution, or are those long-term effects?
I think they're long-term, and I think it's going to be supply chain technology and supply chain, teams and expertise that are going to be kind of the beneficiaries of kind of the crisis that we've seen. I do see it as being long-term, and I see businesses now looking at like multi-year investment strategies when it comes to supply chain technology.
Yeah, and Onno, what long-term effects do you see from shippers? Are they reacting to the current situation in ocean freight?
I think, there always have been problems in the logistic chains. So the often heard, and I think we'll tackle that later. But do you move your supply chain? Do you make it less global, more local? That's something we've been hearing now for years, and it's always, will this be the wake-up call that you actually change your supply chain with a sourcing strategy based in the Far East back to home? We've seen very differing signals on that. And of course, it's a very hard thing to do. I mean, if you're used to having your sourcing networks indeed in the Far East, it's often not an easy thing to say, okay, is there somebody in Europe who can do this? Or is there somebody in the US who can supply my local market with the same product at a competitive price?
Yeah, the question is not only price, but do we have production capacity and even the commodities in Europe that's needed for production?
And are we then willing to pay a higher price because of higher manufacturing costs it's always, I think, it's a balance between supply chain security and, of course, cost effectiveness.
Yeah, let's see what the audience sees in their field. So I'm asking technicians to start a third poll. And the third poll states, do you see shippers move to nearshoring? Yes, but only thinking about it. Yes, and I already see concrete actions of them, or no. So I'm curious what the audience thinks. Richard, what do you think? Is nearshoring a long-term solution, or will we just keep on having our production in the Far East?
I see it as a solution for part of the product catalog. So, for example, especially in the retail space, like personalization, niche products, we do see, a move to nearshoring because you just have a faster supply chain, and you can incur, you can wear the additional cost that's involved. I think there is, some hubs, manufacturing hubs in Europe that are developing in particular areas where they've been able to, be quite cost competitive, and now they're achieving quite a lot of scale as well. So, I do see, for example, in apparel, some of that continuing. It's like, particularly in the higher end part of the market. But I would say that, there is a lot of expertise in the Far East that cannot easily be replicated, both in terms of manufacturing processes and technical skills. And, when our customers have been visiting factories in Europe and having those conversations and trying to understand if a particular SKU can be made in Europe, oftentimes the answer is actually no. It can't be made at a similar or, comparable cost. And sometimes it can't be made at all. So I think it's a bit of a mixed answer, but I think everyone will be thinking about it and looking at it, having those conversations. But I don't see a wholesale change in the immediate term.
Yeah, and right now we are approaching the holiday season. Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and so on is coming close, and all those products should be loaded in Shanghai, for example, right now. Should we be worried for empty web shops, out of stock articles during the holiday season, do you think?
Look, I think there are going to continue to be some delays, and so certain items might run low on stock. I think the supply chain is moving, but certainly, there are capacity constraints. So I would imagine that the supply chain remains in the headlines for the coming months.
Yeah. So Onno, we had a look at the BIMCO analysis, and there were some graphs, and they said, well, of course, there's congestion a lot, but and people are saying that some shipping lines are taking ships out of business at the moment. But according to BIMCO, that wasn't true. They showed that there is even more capacity deployed at the moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Indeed, the idle capacity, so ships actively being taken out of service, that was really low at the moment. But ships waiting at LA Long Beach, if you have 70 ships, that's 70 times, let's say, average 10,000 TEUs?
Yeah, at least. Yeah,
at least. That adds up to a lot of idle capacity. So
the number of ships is increasing, but the capacity is slowing down
because of all the slack in the supply chain at the moment. So that's one interesting remark.
But still, I'm not. We touched it a little bit in the beginning of this webinar. But what is really causing all those delays at the port?
Yeah. I would say that it's now, at the moment, it's a combination of still some blank sailings, indeed going, not meeting your estimated time of departure at the port of departure. If your cargo is at the berth, can it go to a hinterland destination, or is it stuck for already a couple of days at the port and then waiting for further transshipment? And that, of course, adds, in an already tight supply chain, the smallest deviation cascades into the rest of the supply chain.
And can we blame Corona, or is that long ahead of us?
Who started? When the first reaction was, okay, so shippers saw Corona kicking in, cancelling orders. Were they then the first mover, or was it afterwards the ocean liners who said, okay, if nobody's going to move stuff around, I will... why would I remain to my schedule? And that was the introduction of all the blank sailings. But are they then to blame? It's an interesting one. It was what I said at the beginning.
If you have a delay at Long Beach at the moment, you'll never make it back in time in Shanghai to go to Rotterdam. So you have a blank sailing.
I think
I would say that the problem is really not overall capacity, it's average capacity, right? Like the average capacity that the problem is not that, well, the other way around. It's not the average capacity that you have in any given week. It's a problem of, it's really a problem of things getting out of sync. And when things get out of sync, you have spikes in any given week. And then you create massive bottlenecks. This is really a problem of, we were living in a world of just in time, everything moving, like clockwork, and you had a certain amount of capacity, not enough slack. We're now operating in a world where things go out of whack, and suddenly you have 4, 5, 10, 70, 100 vessels all wanting to berth in the same week, and then the vessels can't get back on time. So when you look at any of the numbers, what's very interesting is seeing the tiny percentage changes in demand that are having this enormous impact in numbers of weeks of delays, really just because everything is so tight at each port that if you get things out of sync, you're suddenly in this, in this massive constraint scenario.
Yeah, so the logistics sector is really good at optimizing things and really taking it down. So optimize to the last bit, but if then something goes wrong, you see the effects going on. There's a question from Ferry Splinter, and Richard, maybe it's for you to handle. Until when do you expect this situation to sustain? Because jury says the end of next year, but it will be phased into 2023 even. We have Chinese New Year coming as an important factor. So when will this be resolved, do you think?
I think, with the exception of certain ports where there are real, like long-term problems and, other areas where, for example, there are driver shortages that will take more time to work their way out of the system. I think the capacity is broadly there, that if we get into a situation where we have fewer of these spikes, we can work it through the systems that are by the end of next year. And that would be because vaccination really takes hold and we have less closures and international travel and international restrictions on, port closures and things like that, stops being so frequent. I would then see that, like 2023, 2024 should be more normalized. I would imagine somewhat elevated because we do see growth in demand more broadly from an economic perspective. But I would see much more normalization, 2023, 2024. It all, we're talking about the new variant in the UK, but I'm hoping that that's not having any significant impact in terms of hospitalization. If everyone can get comfortable with that globally, and we can go back to somewhat more normalized, frequency of actual physical closures, I do think that things will start to normalize towards the back end of 2022. What I would say is that this electricity crunch in China is something that's on my radar as being something to think about.
I think in general, indeed, very good point. High energy prices, higher inflation, indeed. Will the macroeconomic outlook remain as good as it is now, or we will see, if we see cooling of the economy, that also, if that hampers demand, then you also will see easing in the supply chain. But that's of course, yeah.
So you mean, like we already saw in the Netherlands, maybe it's in China happening as well, that some factories are shutting down because of too high energy prices and
yeah, and especially, of course, you see that economic growth is still. We don't want to believe, but it's still closely linked to energy prices, and high energy prices, it's bad for consumers in the end.
Yeah.
So if these prices remain at a very high level, we might see consumer confidence falling.
We might order less stuff from China for e-commerce. What do you think, Richard? If energy prices will be high for the whole winter, will we buy less stuff from China? And of course, that leads to less shipping capacity needed.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the knock-on effect in terms of the inflation will be as immediate as that, although I could see some cooling from this, cost-based inflation that we're seeing in Europe. I think the energy issue that, I think is quite immediate is in China where, there's some managed control of the factories in terms of, when they have energy and when they don't have energy. And that can have an impact on, it can actually have an impact really on sailings and, the ability of shippers to get their goods to port on time because factories are operating to different cargo ready dates. And that can have, both positive and negative effects on the market because, it can mean that, prices drop in a given week for vessels that aren't full. but it also means that suddenly you have a knock-on effect, and in following weeks you can have you can have undercapacity. So I would say it's just one for volatility, but I would watch the macroeconomic outlook in general in terms of this inflation. But I don't see it maybe as having a Q1 impact on demand. I think it's going to be felt later.
Yeah, longer run.
Yeah,
I agree.
So let's do some questions from the audience. Onno, this one I'm passing to you. Rob Harlow wants to know, how do you view the role of carriers in helping to solve these capacity issues? Do you think with the amount of profit being made, they could invest more in solving the capacity constraints, both in the infrastructure on the US West Coast, as well as equipment availability?
Yeah, I think when it comes to equipment availability, there's definitely a role for the carriers. They still own a very large part of the worldwide container fleet. And when it comes to terminal infrastructure, that's of course a different picture, with some ocean liners also having within their same holding a terminal operating company. And then, of course, it's whose task is it to solve the congestion? It's a good suggestion, because in the end there will be money, but
there will be 150 billion of profit this year.
It's enormous. Probably quite a bit will be distributed to the shareholders, because they have been waiting for so long to actually see some return on their investment. But it will be interesting to see indeed what the terminal operating companies will do. If they think it's a structural effect, there will be more pressure to invest. But if it's only will last for a couple of months, then you don't want to invest that heavily in expanding the capacity of your terminal.
No, because overcapacity is too expensive.
Yes, that hurts your business. Yeah.
Yes. And another question, this one is for you, Richard. It's from Jolien Kruid. She wants to know, transport is also facing quite some sustainability challenges. How do you see the same interaction with the current capacity challenges, if at all? So is it related, the capacity challenges and the need for sustainability investments?
For sure. I mean, one of the things is, customers think about how do they have better utilization of their assets, which obviously has an impact on sustainability. And I think more and more there's a bit of a trade-off there, because you might be building in a longer lead time into your business, and then having to make a decision, okay, if I want to go for 100% utilization, I'm going to have to wait, and I'm going to have to wait on an already longer lead time. So, am I willing to run containers, for example, half full from Asia, in order to move them faster? Obviously, there's a cost constraint there, but it does definitely play into the calculus. In some ways it makes it difficult to make that trade-off. I think the other thing is, we talked about the mode switching, right? Like more people moving to air, and then the question is, what is the sustainability of air? I think one of the interesting things in that debate is and I've always sort of grapple with this, is what is the real sustainability of air? For example, a lot of cargo is moving in freighter aircraft, and you could argue that freighter aircraft is less sustainable than moving cargo on passenger aircraft, because the passenger aircraft are going anyway. So you're actually not sort of net adding to the carbon footprint, although you are to some extent increasing the profitability of the airlines, which maybe then makes it easier for them to fly. But I think all of those questions are questions that kind of almost need to be put forward from the consumer in a way, because the consumer is starting to really care about the ethics of their retailers, of the retailers they're buying from, and retailers have to think about what are their ethics when it comes to sustainability and transport. And that's something that we've actually helped customers to think about those trade-offs, to measure the carbon impact, and to look at different ways of measuring it, and then to offset as well. So we have seen I would say less the transport crisis having an impact on sustainability, but I would say COVID and the fact that people were at home, the cars weren't moving, and the air was a bit cleaner, and we saw them kind of reassessing what sustainability means to the environment.
And Richard,
is very important.
Yes, another question for you, Richard, from Bart Pijpops. And he notices shipping lines are currently simply rejecting shipments containing dangerous goods, for example, like lithium-ion batteries. Do you see that as well, and is there any outlook on that, or easing to be expected?
So yeah, we do see that. I think it depends on the shipping line. Some of the shipping lines are accepting the dangerous goods, but it's basically that when you have the dangerous goods on board, and you have a mix of dangerous goods. Also, there are regulations about where they can be stowed on the ship, and they have an impact on the capacity that those shipping lines can achieve, and essentially the yield that they can achieve from the vessel. But that's weighed against the fact that they might charge more for the dangerous goods, and also that they want to have the long-term relationships with the dangerous goods shippers. So I would say it's one of those where you need to have more agility. I would plan more buffer into your supply chain if you're a dangerous goods shipper, and I would have more options in terms of shipping lines, because they may turn off and turn on their policies, change how they want to operate as it regards to dangerous goods. If you have more options of shipping lines and you have a larger buffer, you're going to be in a better shape then.
Yeah. So to conclude this webinar, Richard, if you would have one short advice for shippers and producers who want to ship their cargo from the Far East to Europe, what should be on top of their list?
Yeah, I would say that they need to have, they need to make investments in data to be able to understand what they need, when and why, and where it is. And those investments now, that they make now are going to pay off over the long run. And that's working with the right partner, but it's also about getting yourself in order internally in terms of the way that your team works and the access to your own data. And the other thing I would just say as part of that kind of focus on data is bringing all your teams together around it. So buying and merchandising and sales and finance and shipping and logistics all work together around the same goals. And if you can do that, I think you'll have a relative success in this market.
Yes. Richard Fattal, co-founder of Zencargo, thank you for joining us here.
Thank you very much.
So, Onno, I still have the results of the poll for you. So the question was, do you see shippers move to nearshoring? And the answer is 43% says yes, but only thinking about it. 33% says yes and already see concrete actions, and 24% says no. So a vast majority sees a little bit of movement towards this. So final question for you to conclude this webinar. What needs to be done to have a normalized situation as soon as possible for the ocean freight?
First, I think part of it was already addressed, but you can, in the end, you can change your own behavior, and everybody is thinking not only about the day of tomorrow, but especially the day after tomorrow. That might help the situation, because still what you often see, and there's no one to blame there, but in logistics, the horizon is very short. I mean, in the longer run effects are often, they're only taken into account when there's a crisis like now. So probably if the situation becomes better, then the question on nearshoring will be answered differently, and then everybody thinks, okay, no, yeah, it was a hiccup back then, but now we're back to the old normal. And I think my main message always to the sector is understand your role, that it's broader than moving cargo from A to B, or you're enabling supply chains, and then be in a dialogue with both your customer and see what's happening in the world around you. And yeah, so I fully support the message that requires data, not only of your own system, but also look what's happening in the world around you.
Yeah, but which party can we blame for the current problems?
In the end, it's all as a customer, because of what you buy in the stores. In the end, indeed, as I started, all the individual choices being made right now are understandable from the point of view from that individual person. But in the end, the equation, it adds up to the current hiccup. So it's a hard thing. I mean, in the end, logistics would benefit from somebody being able to make all the decisions, but it's not. It's a complicated system with a lot of different decision makers.
So the world is more complicated, and often we exaggerate our abilities to
control things.
To control things.
Yeah. We overestimate also our rationality, but in the end, to end on a positive note, in the end it will work out. Every logistics crisis we see, in the end it will work out. So that's a positive note to end with.
That's a good note to end. Onno de Jong, researcher at Ecorys, thank you for joining me here in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. I want to thank you all for your participation and see you all next time.